Good morning. Well, it may seem that there's nothing more to be said about the facts of the matter as they now lie before us of the denial of funding to Kairos by the federal government and particularly by International Development Minister Bev Oda. As things are progressing at this point, it seems very likely that opposition charges will continue to focus on demands for the minister's resignation. But it's the position of the Green Party of Canada that we do not yet have all the facts, that further investigations must take place, and that the full and complete story of how Kairos' funding was rejected be revealed. Up till this moment, we've only had questioning in the House of Commons and in the Parliamentary Committee of the minister herself and of senior CETA aides and senior staff, including, of course, the Vice President and the President. What we need to know is what were the involvements of other political elements of the Harper government. Jason Kenney's involvement as Minister of Immigration and a previous critic of Kairos is critical to this case. The fact that Stockwell Day had also been a critic of Kairos is significant. The lobbying efforts of Charles McVety from the Canadian Family Action Policy Group is worth investigating. But most significant is what was the role of the Prime Minister's office. I say this because the facts as now put forward by Ms. Oda simply don't wash. It simply makes no sense that she did not sign the document until the word "not" was inserted. I put it to you, having worked in a minister's office, having had a lot of experience with how CETA handles and other departments handle documents, recommendations go to a minister's office from senior staff. If the minister doesn't like the recommendation, there's a simple procedure. The reason that the documents as presented to Minister Oda did not create a space by which she could reject the recommendation is very straightforward and very simple. Documents did not require a place to say, I reject this recommendation, because the procedure over time immemorial in parliamentary tradition, you can, I suppose, go to BBC Yes Minister for further evidence, is simply to leave the document unsigned. Ministers who do not like departmental advice have a number of options. They can send it back to the ministerial staff, to the departmental staff, and say, I'm not going to sign it the way it is. We want to see the amount reduced. We want to see this proposal reworked. Or they just let it sit on their desk gathering dust. I worked from 1986 to 1988 as a senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment, and certainly there were times when a document wasn't getting signed in a timely manner or the minister didn't like the advice. The idea that the document was signed by Ms. Oda after the insertion of the word "not" simply stretches credulity to the breaking point. I can't buy it. It doesn't wash. It makes no sense. It's far more likely that she signed the document accepting the departmental advice, which was based, by the way, not only on internal CETA advice, but on an independent, thorough investigation of the efficacy of Kairos' work. The recommendation to continue to fund was made by not just senior CETA officials, but by a thorough review of whether the government of Canada and the people of Canada were getting value for money in the development assistance work, the human rights work that Kairos was undertaking around the world. It doesn't make any sense that she's telling the truth now. It makes more sense that she was telling the truth last year. So here's what we know. We know that senior CETA officials recommended to the minister that Kairos' assistance be extended. We know that they signed, that is, Mr. Singh and Ms. Biggs signed the recommendation to the minister in September. The minister signed the document. We don't know whether it included the word "not" when she signed it or not, but she signed it on November 27th, 2009. Kairos' funding had been extended a number of times, but was to end November 30th. So certainly there would have been some pressure on the minister to sign that document in order to extend Kairos' funding. What we do know is that by 3 days later, November 30th at 2:30 in the afternoon, Kairos received a phone call from CETA staff to say that the funding had been denied, against all previous indications, against all previous communications with CETA staff. We don't know who inserted the word not, but we now have Ms. Oda's protestations that she directed that the word be added. I think we need a full, thorough investigation, because the likely scenario is that she signed the approval, it was subsequently rejected. We know that the Harper government has created a bottleneck for all decisions, all speeches, all press releases, all funding decisions flow through the Prime Minister's office. So the questions about the way this is handled must be answered up to and including the Prime Minister's office. When did they know that CETA planned to continue to fund Kairos? What steps did the Prime Minister's office take to cancel funding? And was there any connection, because certainly the timing is suggestive, between the decision to cancel Kairos' 35-year relationship with CETA on the afternoon of the last day of their funding, and the fact that approximately 2 weeks later, Minister of Immigration Jason Kenney was to be delivering a speech in Israel to a forum on anti-Semitism. Mr. Kenney's speech, as we know, included claiming credit in Canada for denying funding to a number of groups, including the Canadian Arab Federation and others. But he threw Kairos into the mix, saying here was an organization that the government of Canada was convinced had been playing a pivotal role in campaigns to boycott Israel. None of those claims were true in Mr. Kenney's speech, but he made them anyway. This is not something that can be laid at the door of Bev Oda. So the position that we take on this is it's not a question of how long will Prime Minister Harper continue to support his minister when she's clearly been found to have changed her story, which means I think we'll see later in the day as opposition parties bear in on this, that this is a case of contempt of Parliament. But the questions mustn't end there. It's not a question of how long will Mr. Harper continue to support Ms. Oda. It's much more likely the question of how long will Ms. Oda continue to cover for her boss. La question clé ici, il y a beaucoup de questions dans les derniers mois. Et la question qui occupe tout le monde, c'est qui a modifié ce document? Qui est responsable pour le document trafiqué de l'ACDI? Mais la question clé est différente. Et je pense que la question clé, ce n'est pas qui a modifié le document, mais c'est qui a pris la décision d'annuler le fonds à Kairos. C'est une question différente et c'est une question avec lien au le bureau du Premier ministre, parce que c'est le Premier ministre et son bureau qui a pris toutes les décisions de le gouvernement de M. Harper. Ce n'est pas un gouvernement avec beaucoup d'indépendance pour le ministre. C'est vraiment un cas qu'il y a le chef, et le chef qui a pris toutes les décisions maintenant, on doit demander à M. Harper qu'est-ce que c'est son engagement, son implication dans cette décision. Ce n'est pas une question qui a résolu, il n'y a pas de solution pour ce problème d'avoir que Mme Oda quitté le cabinet. Ce n'est pas une réponse adéquate pour ce problème qui est à la fond une question de responsabilité et l'interférence en politique dans les décisions pour le bien-être du monde, pour le bien-être d'un système de gouvernement qui marche sans influence et sans interférence politique. With that, I'd be very happy to answer any questions you have. The only other details that I think are significant in this matter that I would mention is that I don't think there's been much media attention to the fact that Kairos, believing Ms. Oda when she said that they were no longer a fit because of a change in priorities, did go to all the difficulty, which is not insignificant, of proposing again a different approach to their work around the world. They submitted a proposal in March of 2010. They have not received any response to that proposal, and CETA staff is no longer allowed to speak to them. I think this suggests a very deep level of interference, a political targeting of Kairos, which has not yet been adequately dealt with at all by the nature of the questions that we're seeing in the House of Commons. And with that, please, I'd take any questions you have.
If we It's an investigation we need to determine who wrote the word not and whether the word not was inserted because the PMO ordered Vavoda to insert the word not after she had essentially approved CETA's recommendation. Who should do the investigation?
It's a very good question. There are a couple of routes that could be taken. None of them are perfect. I mean, the ideal situation would be a Royal Commission of Inquiry, because you really need to look at a number of levels of what went on within the government. The RCMP could investigate it as a case of fraud to find out who wrote the word not, but that is such a narrow focus that it doesn't get to the question of, for instance, if they decide to throw a junior staffer under the bus and say, oh, this guy, he did it. I mean, that's the pattern. We've seen that over and over again. Jasmine McDonnell sent out to the, exiled because she left a document behind. We've seen people come and go. Junior staff is sometimes young Mr. Sparrow, Ryan Sparrow, has been in and out, sometimes accused of being responsible for something that goes wrong and then brought back into their midst. I don't think that'll solve anything to say, well, it was somebody else that was responsible. That's their pattern.
Does it then? You surely can't expect this government to appoint a royal commission.
That's the problem. That's why
so
the parliamentary committee has shown some real courage in continuing to investigate it. At least they should be asking more questions about the relationship to the PMO. In terms of what...
Before you leave that, I mean, is that, from your perspective, is that something the Mounties ought to do?
Well, it is an act. The way in which the documents were doctored suggests forgery and fraud, which are under the criminal code offenses. So that is at least an aspect that should be explored. I mean, none of the, and your question is good, Mark, none of the obvious routes are going to happen in a government that doesn't want to explore what happened. Normally, I mean, if you look at, historically in Canada, we had the Gomery Commission, and Paul Martin, as Prime Minister, called it, even though it was not clearly in his political self-interest to do so. This government doesn't act against political self-interest. So it's going to be hard to see how we'll get to get these questions answered. An aggressive media that continues to ask the questions, that follows the trail, that tries to find out what was the connection between Mr. Kenney's upcoming speech and the decision not to fund Kairos. Mr. Kenney hasn't been asked very many questions on this matter, and I think it's certainly suggestive that there was some role there. The question of why Kairos was targeted, given that their reports by independent evaluators were exemplary. There are a lot of disturbing elements to this. It fits a pattern within the Harper government, but that doesn't mean it should be just left with a pile of things that look like abuse of power and distortion of our traditional role in the world. And this is extremely troubling at a very fundamental level of how government should operate. And the normal course of things, we'll see Mr. Harper defend Ms. Oda till he can do it no longer, and she'll take the fall. And that's not the right question. We're not asking the right questions yet. The right questions are still, when you look at Ms. Oda's language for the last year, she's always said it was the government's decision. That has been taken by many of us to mean that CETA made the decision in its normal decision-making process. I think a likely interpretation of everything Ms. Oda has said since the funding to Kairos was denied was that it was a government decision being made above her head.
Ms. May, you started the thought saying it's far more likely that she signed a document accepting the advice.
Yes.
But you didn't finish it. I'm just wondering, so what happened next?
Well, that's... All right, likely plausible scenario. We know that every decision in this government is reviewed by the Prime Minister's office. Every funding decision, every press release, every time... Anytime anyone working within civil service is asked a question from the media, they have to check and find out with their minister if they're allowed to answer that question. The levels of control are extremely tight. And we all know that the levels of control are tight and bottlenecked in the Prime Minister's office. So the possibility that Madam Oda could have approved CETA funding of Kairos without running it by the PMO, the chances that she was making an independent decision that never went to the Prime Minister's office is about nil.